Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you. Please continue eating, but silently. We're going to start our program now because we want to make sure to get you all out on time and back to your offices or homes or wherever you're going after this. So I'll be mercifully brief, partly because I'm losing my voice, as you can tell, which is probably a blessing in disguise. I've just been asked, before we get to our speaker, to just remind you we've got a couple of places left for a couple of upcoming events. On the 25th, we have a vegan dinner by Jasmine. Well, that sounds really interesting. Oh, make sure you sign up for that. And also, on the 29th of January, we have Lawrence Lau. He's going to be talking about the U.S.-China trade war. And I was just walking through Pacific Place the other day, and I saw Lawrence Lau's new book on the U.S.-China trade war sitting in the bookshelf. So that's going to be one you don't want to miss. But coming up for today's event, we've got the, as you saw from the flyers and you all signed up, we're going to hear about the BBC World Service. And I can just tell you in my own story, I didn't actually know much about the World Service until I was posted for the Washington Post as the Africa correspondent in Nairobi. And I was friends with the BBC World Service correspondent in Nairobi there. And we were traveling around together, and I thought I was a nice young hotshot in the early 90s, and we would go knock on doors, and we went to see Kenneth Kaunda, who had been president of Zambia. And I walked up, and we got an interview, an appointment time at his home, and we walked up, and I said, "I'm with the Washington Post." And he said, "Who's with the World Service?" And, and I was so embarrassed. And he said, I always listen to the World Service, so that really put me in my place. What I didn't realize at that time was that the World Service was not only in English, which I assume President Kaunda was listening to, but it was also put out in 42 other languages. And so that's what our guest is going to speak to us about today, is how you put out the news in 40, well, it says 40 plus languages on the slides here. It said 42 on the flyers. So we're going to get some precision on that question as well. And we're going to hear about all the ins and outs. I specifically want to hear how you put out the news in Xhosa. So without further ado, Jamie Angus.
Thank you so much. Well, thank you very much, Keith. And I'll start straight away with the point of how many languages we actually operate in. And as testimony to the complexity and scale of the World Service, that even I can't quite agree on how many languages it is. So we think it's 42, but it depends on whether you count Kinyarwanda. So there are two Great Lakes languages we do, and it depends on whether you count the two Great Lakes languages as one language or two languages. So it's either 42 or 43, and I can never remember whether we include Serbian or not, because we added in Serbian quite late in the day. So we think the number is in the low 40s. So I think we'll stick with that. Thank you very much for coming to see the talk today. It's a great honour and privilege to be back at the FCC. I was here about 18 months ago and was speaking about the future of TV news channels and the future of the commercial advertising industry on international TV news channels. And it's nice to see some of you come back again for the next instalment. But I wanted to talk about something completely different today, which was our mission to provide the news in 40 however many languages, and just some interesting reflections on some of the challenges that poses. We've increased the number of languages we do. We've added 12 new language services in recent years because of additional investment from the UK government, which is extremely welcome. But I would like to explore with you some of the challenges that making the news in multiple languages poses for us, and just to give you a bit of insight to what our language service journalists do every day. So let's start just by talking about shifting use of languages and language patterns in journalism. I just tried to think of a few English examples, actually, just to give you a sense of it, of loaded value words that have changed over time. And because, of course, language is a living thing, a living entity, and just as our language and use of language changes, so journalism's use of those words needs to change as well. So the couple of examples that I've pulled up here for English, which I'm sure you're familiar is a couple of gender words which we no longer use, rightly, but probably you would have heard in output, 20 or even 10 years ago. And then actually I just put the term up, committing suicide, which again is a words that you no longer hear on the BBC because people feel that it's unhelpfully value loaded about mental illness, so we no longer use these terms. And it just goes to show that whatever language you're operating in, even in English, our shifting patterns of using words changes year by year. So let's jump into a few examples, practical examples from our actual language services. To talk a little about the BBC Bengali service, which broadcasts to a Muslim majority country and also a Hindu country. So obviously we broadcast to Bangladesh itself, but also to the state of West Bengal in India, and that this presents some practical difficulties. So let's just jump into that. So there are two different ways of saying hello in Bengali, and you'll have to forgive it, my pronunciation is going to be awful throughout this, but obviously salam alaikum you're very familiar with, and the other way that you can say it in Indian part of in West Bengal is namaskar. So we've got two potential ways of saying hello, but of course each of those ways is value loaded, and if you use one term then the other section of the audience is not very happy because they think it sounds as if you're siding with another part of the language diaspora. So the way that we've come up with to solve this is what we say in Bengali. So the Bengali presenters say good day because this is something that everyone can agree on and is not controversial in any way. So that's a slightly trivial example, but it gets a bit more serious than that. So any terms to do with religion are potentially problematic. So when you're referencing God in broadcasting, which terms should you use? So obviously in a world where Islam is very much in the news, we sometimes need to use words referring to Allah and other Islamic religious terms, or potentially, again for the Bengalis, if you were talking about the Hindu god, you'd be talking about Bhagwan. So again, if you would, depending on which of these you choose, you inevitably cause offence to some section of the population. So again, we've come up with a compromise and we just refer to the creator, which is something everyone can agree on, even if it's not actually the word that audiences would use. An interesting example. So these kinds of political and religious divisions have a long impact on the way that languages is used for news organisations. And it's something that we had to look at extensively when we started our new Korean language service, because one of the new language services that we've added is in the Korean language, and this service broadcasts on radio, medium wave and shortwave to audiences in North Korea, but it also has a digital service for audiences in South Korea and, if you like, global Koreans, so Korean diaspora audiences all around the world. And it poses an interesting problem because there are different words in Korean and North and South Korean dialects for different concepts. So even the name of the country is unclear. So South Koreans refer to North Korea as Bukhan. And of course, the North Koreans have a different word for their own country, which is Joseon. And they're separately, although I won't go into it, the same applies to the South. So both the North and the South have different ways of referring to their own country. So we've again come up with a pretty predictable compromise, which is to refer to the whole thing as Korea, because this is an ancient term for the peninsula which both North and South understand. But you can see that wherever we turn, we have to make these compromises to make sure that our content is seen to be fair and not targeting particular geographical or religious communities in the languages we operate in. Let's just look at some slightly close to home. So we've got a big challenge in how we do Chinese. Sorry, the words are a bit small here, but we maintain really high quality Chinese business coverage, and we had to look in detail about how we would re-version business content into into all different forms of China. So the Chinese, for Mandarin and for dialect here in the South, and indeed for Taiwan. We have a glossary, if you like, on the BBC Learning site, the BBC Academy Learning site, that versions all the different business terms as you can see from the chart, into the 3 different forms of Chinese. And obviously we have a language service site both in simplified Chinese characters and for Cantonese as well. So the potential complications of rendering business use into Chinese are very great indeed, and we standardise the way that we do that, and we have a standardised learning tool so that all our Chinese business journalists can be using the same the same terms to avoid confusion. So that's another potentially problematic area. Let's look at another more political one, which I'm sure you'll be aware of. Everything to do with the monarchy in Thailand, as you know, is particularly sensitive, and this is not simply a cultural issue, but it is an issue enshrined in Thai law. And the BBC, like other international broadcasters, seeks to observe local laws wherever we can. We operate within the law in the countries that we operate in. We obviously have journalists in Thailand, so all coverage of the Thai monarchy is potentially problematic for international broadcasters. And I just thought we'd look a bit at some of the issues around the death of the former king who died 18 months ago, and the accession of the new king. So there are 3 different words that you could use in Thai to describe someone's death. And so these are, I'm not going to try and read these ones actually, but so you could say the king has departed to heaven. But you can't use the word dead because that is perceived to be offensive, and the different terms that you use would be dependent on the person's social position as well. So it's really important to choose the right one. But in the instance of the Thai king, we felt on legal advice that none of these terms were appropriate, and the compromise was to say that the king is no longer alive. So there we go, an elegant solution that no one could find fault with. Let's look a bit at problematic calendars. This is from the Great Lakes Service, and these 2 languages are Kinyarwanda and Kirundi, which are the 2 which I can never remember whether we can count them as 1 or 2, but they're 2 parallel and linked languages for Rwanda and Burundi. And our Great Lakes Service, a very valuable service for audiences in those countries, and do radio broadcasts and digital news as well. But the really complicated thing is that the word, I'm going to read this one, the word Nyakanga in Kinyarwanda means the month of July, but the same word means the month of September in the other language. So you have one word which has completely different meanings in both languages, so you have to be very careful. And the solution that the service came up with was to use numbers for months rather than names. So they just talk about 7 and 9, I should say. Here's another trivial example. So we just, our LATAM journalists say there are 7 different words for popcorn in Spanish. And every time you pick one of the words to use, you say a little bit about, where you're from and your kind of background and cultural values. There's no kind of value neutral way of describing popcorn in Spanish, so I put up the different words here for you. Those of you who are Spanish speakers, you can enjoy. I won't massacre them myself. So the one that they chose for this particular story is the one relevant to the local market. So if you're writing a story about popcorn in Mexico, then this is the term that you would use, because that's the Mexican term. So Spanish, obviously a huge global language, one with enormous regional variations that can create complications for news journalists. And I think one of the complications we need to be aware of is that reversioning translated material can affect the time it takes to say something. So English is a relatively compact language, but other languages can take a great deal of time to say relatively simple things. And if you have a finite amount of time in which to do your broadcast, so you're trying to read a 1-minute news summary, that can be quite problematic. So we're going to come on to a few practical examples of that. But first, I'd just like to talk about some more slightly editorially tricky translation issues which we've come across in the language services, and these are to do with kind of cultural issues and cultural ways of referring to difficult concepts, and ways in which words are value loaded. Okay, so this particular example from reporting of a military conflict, where when we did the retranslation back into English, we discovered that the language service was saying that soldiers had pulled back from the front line, whereas what they actually meant was soldiers had retreated. I had been in like a military defeat, and it was a way in which the precise use of language kind of concealed rather than revealed things about the nature of the story. And so we're always asking our journalists to be really careful whether, when they are translating, if they are somehow distorting the meaning or using euphemism or imprecise language in translation when they could be more clear. So let's have a look at another more controversial example. So this is an absolutely classic issue that we come up with against, particularly in Arabic and Persian and some of the other Middle Eastern, South Asian languages that we operate in, which is how you describe militancy and military action. So we noticed that some of the language services were using these euphemistic phrases like the man with the sword, men with the sword, to instead of using a word that more explicitly said insurgency. And we had quite a sort of complex editorial debate about whether this is the right thing to do, because often the language service journalists say, well, actually this is the sort of culturally understood way of referring to these issues, and this is the right thing to do. And in the end, we wanted to be as clear as possible, so we tend to avoid using euphemistic language, which sometimes the vernacular journalists instinctively want to use in what is, after all, their own language. So it's a difficult debate. Here's another one, obviously very, very tricky cultural issue which we deal with a lot, which is gender violence and sensitivity about talking about rape and other forms of gender violence in vernacular languages. So again, we noticed that some of the language services occasionally used euphemism to refer to rape, and we wanted to make sure that we weren't doing this, because we felt that it was a value judgment to do that, and that we wanted to be really clear that we were using the words to do with rape and gender violence clearly and uniformly in whatever language service we were operating. And to be fair to them, some of our journalists said, well, actually, it's culturally understood to refer to rape in this way, and it's a better way of doing it because it doesn't stigmatise rape victims. And I think in the end we took the view that that wasn't something we could live with, so we wanted our language services to be much clearer about the terms that they were using. Here's another one along the same lines, which is this use of the term martyrs to refer to deaths in military conflicts, which again, something that springs up quite regularly, and again we've had to be quite consistent about the fact that we don't use these terms, and that we refer very clearly to people being killed in military conflict if that's what's happened. So let's just do a few examples of why, going back to my previous point about why things can take some more time to say in languages than other languages. So we've got a few translation examples here. So we do Indonesian has 300 local languages, but we tend to use the sort of standardized Indonesian for the Indonesian service, but they have a particular problem with the length of translations, because often when you translate simple things into Indonesian they go on longer, and the example they pulled out for me, which is to say you tend to kind of repeat the concept. So instead of saying I like fried rice, it's very delicious, they would say I like fried rice is very delicious. And if you imagine amplifying this process through several minutes of script, you can see that it creates an issue for the length of the broadcasts. We just wanted to give you another example from Indonesian, which is that there's different ways of using plurals in different languages. So often a way of using a plural is to repeat the word twice. So the Indonesians would say flower, flower instead of saying flowers in the plural, which again, if you were trying to perpetuate that through a whole load of new scripts, can mean that everything just takes much more time than it needs to. Here's another example from Hindi about different ways that you would refer to the same concept. Hindi is really complicated because there's a Sanskrit version, there's a formalized Hindi version, and there's kind of street Hindi that you would speak. So these are three different ways of saying the same thing, which is say if MPs left the Parliament building, you would say in the Sanskrit version you would say they boycotted the Parliament. In the formal Hindi you would say they walked out in protest, and in the street version you would say they were running amok in Parliament. And as you can see, each different sets of words takes a different length of time to say, and you have to be very careful about which one you use. So that's a South Asian example. I'm just going to finish with a few remarks about Nigerian languages, which is kind of slightly close to my heart because I was in Nigeria 2 weeks ago, and we've opened 3 new language services in Nigeria in Igbo, Yoruba and Pidgin. I'll say a bit more about Pidgin in a minute, as well as our Hausa language operation in Nigeria. So we've assembled one of the most complex to render words in the Yoruba language. So this is the same word can be pronounced 7 different ways, And as you can see, you need to get it right. Shall we put it that way? I'm not going to try and render these in case there's any Yoruba speakers in the audience who might take offence. But as you can see, a little difference, and I'm sure this is familiar to Chinese speakers. I understand Chinese is very much like this. A very, very small amount of difference can make a big difference to understanding. Again, here's an example from Pashto, and which has very, very, very different nuanced sounds to do with where you put the dots. And so this is the Pashto word for joy, and that is the Pashto word for yogurt. So we need to be extremely careful about which one we render in and be very, very accurate about the way that we do it. Here's another example. So again, this is Pashto, so this is love, and if you make a very slight spelling mistake, it means place. So there we go. So these are the merits of accuracy, and it just reminds me that English, or people often say English is one of the hardest languages to learn, but when I look at what our language service journalists have to go through, I think that actually we have it very lucky indeed. And I speak two other languages other than English. So I speak French and German, and very sadly we don't have a German service, although I'm thinking of reintroducing one just so that I can say that I speak one of the other language service languages. We do have a French service, which is French for BBC Afrique, French for Africa, and broadcast to Francophone Africa. So I can just about do my own editorial review for BBC Afrique, but for the rest of the language services that we cover, I have to trust my colleagues very much to do their jobs and be extremely accurate. So Howard, who's here with me today, who runs BBC Chinese, I place a huge amount of trust in Howard and Vivian to uphold the values that I've just been talking about. But also we have to spend a lot of time formally reviewing editorial output and having it translated bluntly, and so that I can go through a lot of it in English, because I think it's really, really important. As the editor-in-chief for the World Service, I'm responsible for every word, dot and comma of everything that goes out in 42 different languages. So it's very important that we have some accountability and formal review process. Now I'm just going to finish with a clip which we were struggling to produce at volume earlier, so I'm just going to ask my friend to turn up the volume a little bit. This is Pidgin, which is my current favourite language. And Pidgin is it's a street language, it's not a written language, and actually the fact that the BBC started doing the news in Pidgin in Nigeria and West Africa is a very interesting development, because it's the first time that Pidgin has been kind of formalised by any news organisation, and we produced a whole fat style book, sort of BBC style book in Pidgin that formalises how you should refer to everything in Pidgin. So whenever I go to Nigeria, I try and unveil my terrible Pidgin phrases, but the person who does this best of all is Prince Charles. So I'm going to attempt to play Prince Charles doing Pidgin. So let's.
Nearly 30 years have passed since I first came to this city. And having finally made it back here, ladies and gentlemen, all I can say is that God don't butter my bread. As they say out here, if life they show you pepper, my guy, make pepper soup.
So there we go. Prince Charles is very much my style of Pidgin speaker. He can't really speak it at all, but he's having a jolly good go. That was from Prince Charles's visit to Nigeria and West Africa last year. But it's very interesting, a very kind of potent language for us, because there was a huge amount of global interest in Pidgin when we started broadcasting in it. Just because it's sort of close enough to English that people really enjoy it, and they really enjoyed hearing and reading how the Pidgin service rendered international stories into Pidgin. And it's something we're really, really proud of, to actually take a language that's never really been formally codified and written down for the very first time, and to produce the news in that language, and to build a digital audience for Pidgin from scratch. So, well, thank you very much for listening to my ramblings. As I say, when I was here before, I talked about more serious issues, but I wanted to do something a bit more light-hearted for you this time. But I'm sure you may have some more serious questions for me, either on translation or other matters to do with the BBC World Service, and I'm very glad to take your questions if you would like to ask any. So thank you very much for listening. Thank you.
Thank you very much for listening, ladies and gentlemen. And can I remind you all to put your phones on silent as we go to the Q&A section, if you haven't already. And while you're thinking of your questions, I'll take the prerogative of the host to ask the first question. Close to home, since you're here in Asia, and our guest is asked to remain standing for the Q&A part here. That's why I'm seated. Could you tell us how you navigate some of the tricky political issues right here in our part of the world? And for example, do you say South China Sea? Because the Vietnamese call it the Eastern Sea. Or what do you call these island chains that the Japanese call the Senkaku and the Chinese call the Jiayu? And thirdly, since this is the 30th anniversary, what do you call the incident that happened in China on June 4 in 1989?
Happily, I don't precisely know the answer to any of those questions, so I'm thinking if Howard can enlighten me. But I know that the disputed island chains are a particular problem for the World Service. So in English, we usually have, country names generally. So we've had a whole issue with Myanmar and Burma, which is that we agreed to switch formally to using Myanmar a few years ago, and we say Myanmar, sometimes known as Burma, in the first usage to refer English audiences who like to use the term Burma. And we use Burma in the UK for UK audiences, and when we use Burma in the UK, the Myanmarese embassy sometimes rings up and says, why are you using the term Burma in the UK? So I think names are really, really difficult. We tend to, if it's disputed sets of islands, we often use both sets of names and make clear in the first usage and make clear whose term is which, and then settle for one or the other. I mean, this is actually very relevant in the UK, where this also happens in the context of Northern Ireland in the UK. So there's a whole issue about Derry, Londonderry. So the BBC has a formal policy about saying Derry, Londonderry on first usage, and then I think thereafter saying Derry. I think I've got that right. So these kinds of things are not unique to this part of the world, but they are, as you point out, very problematic. I'm going to let Howard. Howard's got 20 minutes to come up with the answer for the sets of islands, and we'll give you a detailed reeled out afterwards.
Okay.
Thank you.
The lady here first.
So, thank you very much for the entertaining presentation. I wonder how you do your recruitment. Do you recruit linguists along with your reporters? And how do you verify that your reporter is actually using the correct term once you've decided on one or the other?
So we recruit journalists, and we don't really recruit linguists, but it's a very perceptive question. And I think it's particularly difficult where you're starting up a new language service from scratch, which is something we've done 12 times in the last 2 years. So I think some of our language services have been around. I was in Nairobi, and BBC Somali's been going for 60 years. So we've sort of got a kind of established culture and style book and a cadre of long-serving journalists, and so there's a cultural understanding. And I think where we've started up new services from scratch, it has been really, really difficult to come up. Korean is fascinating example, and there's just lots of vibrant internal argument about what Korean words we're using and whether they are off-putting to certain sections of the audience or not. So I kind of think we welcome a lot of that internal debate, and what we have to do is, as suggested in the presentation, we have to kind of argue it out privately, then agree, and then be consistent, because I think it's the inconsistency that kills us in the end, because you can't defend that.
One here.
Yes, Jeff Galbraith. You didn't talk much. I'm very curious about your audience, the growth of your audience over the years, with the internet, with the competing media and so forth. Last night I was at Asia Society meeting, and the guy was talking about cutbacks with some government programs, and they're trying to cut back the Voice of America. But he said actually the growth of the audience of Voice America has been tremendous the last couple of years. So that leads my thinking, what's the growth audience? Where are you have the most successful penetration of the World Service, and in what countries are successful?
Thank you. It's a very good question. So the audience, the global audience is growing. It's about 372 million a week. We're on the way to 500 million a week, which is our target for the centenary year of the BBC in 2022. I think a lot of the audience growth actually is still coming from English. So I think the growth in BBC World News and BBC.com is really significant, and particularly the continual performance of the TV channel, which many people have thought would erode over the years, which is what I was talking about a lot when I was last here. I think where we've added new language services, they are putting on quite significant extra reach that people we weren't reaching before. So there's the three new Nigerian languages and 4 new Indian regional languages. So we're doing Bengali, Gujarati, Punjabi, Telugu, which we weren't doing previously. Marathi, sorry, yeah, that was 5. Anyway, so we're doing those new regional languages that we've done, and obviously huge global languages like Hindi, where there's 650 million Hindi speakers. So if you shift the dial by a fraction of % in your reach in the Hindi market, you put on very significant new numbers. So I think a lot of our reach is actually about kind of technical and distribution developments as much as the content. So having better distribution partnerships in a particular market. So what we've done in Marathi, where we're on the Jio handset platform in India with a digital news service, and any, as I say, marginal changes in Arabic, Hindi and Spanish, for example, can produce huge shifts in audience because those are massive global languages. Whereas actually for some of the smaller languages, like, the Serbian service is very important to me, but it's never going to put much headline audience growth on because there's just not that many Serbian speakers.
We're going to come back up here to the French-New Zealand quarter. Will the question be in Maori?
No, I wish. So Florence de Changier, report for Le Monde and the French National Radio. Two other outlets which are similar that I worked for actually, which are RFI, Radio France International, they also broadcast in dozens of languages, and Vatican Radio, which I think has the highest number of languages. In their cases, I'm not sure they have the same challenge because people just broadcast in their own language, and I guess it's the same in the BBC. So when is it that you have this translation issue? Because in most cases, Nigerian would that language would do it for their own audience. And then the follow-up question on that would be, how do you benefit? How does the radio benefit from this? Because you highlighted the challenges, but surely it creates a depth of very interesting, better understanding of culture. So, just to clarify.
No, thank you. And thanks for raising the translation issue, because I really should have made clear in the talk. Our language services aren't predominantly translation services anymore. They're original journalism services. And actually, we've moved from a model, probably 30 years ago, the World Service model was the English core provides a core coverage, and the language services translate that and distribute it around the world. And we've completely shifted our model now, where we employ vernacular journalists, hopefully in local to their national market or regionally to their national market, and we empower them to produce original journalism and to deepen our insight and understanding of that country or region for the benefit of our English audiences. That's the model. I suppose the translation issue comes up because there are still core stories that everyone's going to do, and it is important to be clear and consistent about how we render those. I'm sorry, forgive me. What was the second part of the question?
No, I mean they are intertwined in the sense that indeed I was highlighting the fact that it probably increase the understanding when you have to come to discuss of how this example, the issue of rape, how it cannot be said in this country or whatever. The other services and the other languages would better understand the situation.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right, and it's sort of important not to be too, we have to listen as well as pronounce. We can't just sort of put a central diktat down because we have to listen very carefully to what our language service journalists tell us, because of course they understand the cultural sensitivities very clearly, and actually we've got a responsibility to remain operational. We can't have the operation shut down. So I think the Thai monarchy one is a really good example. It's like the lèse-majesté law in Thailand, as many of you know, is extremely harsh and has been used extremely harshly on journalists. But the BBC needs to be able to operate in Thailand. We wouldn't be serving either our Thai audience or our English audience if we sort of set out to flaunt that law and just to make a point. So these are the kind of uneasy compromises that you end up making, I think.
Thank you.
Dr. Mertz.
Not a doctor, just a translator, Martin Mertz. For something like 400 years, English has had a very good name for the capital of China. But recently, people have started to use a word that I would say 99% of the people in this room can't pronounce correctly. So, will you stand up for English? If the capitals of Russia, Czechoslovakia, or the Czech Republic, and Austria were pronounced in their native tongues, I would accept that perhaps Beijing had a place in English. But for the moment, I don't.
I think you make a reasonable point, which we're quite inconsistent about this, and it's one of the areas in which we are slightly hamstrung between being a domestic UK broadcaster and an international broadcaster. I think we've always tried to, over time, respect local naming customs. So we certainly, so I talked about Burma and Myanmar, and the renaming of Indian cities, for example. This is probably 20 years ago, but we now don't say Bombay and we talk about Chennai and so on, because we respect those naming customs. I think it's difficult because there's a whole bunch of, ultimately, if you adopted local pronunciations, you would end up referring to cities in ways that would be unrecognisable to the English audience. So you wouldn't talk about Paris and Berlin, and because we talk about Paris and Berlin, and actually there's a number of cities that have different names in English. That Varanasi in India is one. I can't remember. Thank you. Yeah, Benares. Exactly. We don't talk about Benares, and we don't talk about Bombay. So I think you make a reasonable criticism. I'm sure every time there's a big China story, the pronunciation unit in the BBC issues fresh guidance as to how to pronounce Beijing properly. Thank you. So because also every UK newsreader tends to have a fresh stab at a foreign pronunciation whenever a new foreign story comes up. So I think the existence of a standardised pronunciation for a broadcaster is really important for that reason.
Yes, right here.
Thank you very much. My name is John Antweiler. I'm a retired American living here in Hong Kong. I have a question relating to political events that are very important in Britain, but have global implications, like Brexit. And how do you report those in local languages without putting a political bent on those, but just reporting what's going on?
Thank you. I'm surprised it took so long to get to the Brexit question, and thank you for posing it in such a disarming and friendly way. I expect Howard and Vivian can lean over and tell you a bit more about how we do it in Chinese. I think we try and restrict ourselves to pretty factual and contextual information about Brexit in languages, because there is a huge thirst amongst audiences to understand, actually, as there is in English globally, to just understand some of the underlying issues behind Brexit, which are so very complicated. And so I think the main audience need for vernacular languages in Brexit is to understand, why is this happening? What are the main poles of the argument, both for the EU and for Britain? Why is the man in the House of Commons picking up the mace and waving it around? Why is there a row about the Speaker's bumper sticker, the Speaker's wife's bumper sticker? All of these are complex stories that need to be carefully elucidated for international audiences. I would say that there is a lively argument around all use of language in English about Brexit. So I was just listening this morning to Rico on Newsday, on World News, who was using the phrase crash out of the EU, referring to a no-deal Brexit, and people often say cliff edge and crash out. And we certainly received complaints, quite animated complaints in the last couple of weeks about that set of language, saying that crash out is a value judgment on a no-deal Brexit. I'm afraid I don't know, because I've been out of the country for a week, but I'm pretty sure we haven't yet said that we're going to stop using it. We think it's up to presenters to make reasonable decisions about the use of language. But that's just a really good example of all language around Brexit is as disputed as the issue itself. And that just is a very difficult path for us to plot a way through in the UK.
And there's a query coming from the extreme left. I mean my extreme left, not your political.
Yeah, as a journalist, of course, I don't have a political stance. Thank you for a very interesting presentation. I work for a Finnish news agency here in Hong Kong, so most of my materials are in Chinese or English, so I can definitely relate to the issues that comes with the translation. So I would be very interested to hear more. What kind of a process do you have to keep the translations, very accurate and consistent? And also, who is, or do you have a working group or something that makes the final decision on how to translate the South China Sea or which? Thank you.
It being the BBC, it's a pretty unclear and opaque process, I think it would be fair to say. So I think in the language services, as I've already indicated, we place a huge amount of trust in our language service journalists, and we also try and foster a culture of open discussion of these kinds of issues, and that for as Vivian and Howard will confirm, you need a really open culture within the language services. So particularly actually, so gender's a really interesting one. I think a lot of the language services have changed quite significantly in the last 10 or 15 years, where some of the language services are based in countries that have very, very strong patriarchal cultural traditions, and therefore the position of women journalists in those language services has been very different to the position in the English language services, and we've made a huge effort as an organisation to be completely sort of culturally blind about this. It's just like if you work for the BBC, we have a set of values that are applied equally whichever language service you're in, and we want men and women in the workplace in the language services as well as in the English language to be able to discuss these issues around sort of talking and naming things openly, which is why I'm particularly interested in the black mark example. I thought that was one of the, when I asked the team to help me put this presentation together, I thought it was one of the most thought-provoking ones that they came up with. And so we really, really rely on language services to sort of discuss this themselves and then sort of escalate it up to me and the senior managers who work for me, so that we can see clearly when there is an issue. And as you know, I keep referring back to this, that there are always similar issues in English. So the use of the word terrorism in English reporting, for example, is just incredibly vexed and disputed in the UK, and everyone's got a different position on it. And when you know, the BBC has a position, but not all of its journalists agree with it or hold to it all the time. So for every disagreement in the languages, there's a similar disagreement in English.
And for the last question, we thought we'd come up to the stage here and get one in Scottish accent.
Yeah. I just wanted to ask you, I mean, the traditional media is under attack as never before from the White House on out. Traditional, distinguished friend Keith Richburg works for the Washington Post, which is now called the fake news media by the American president. I mean, we're all under attack. I'm from a generation when you just believed unquestioningly what was on without any questions, what was on the BBC. But the climate's changed. So if somebody comes to you now and says, okay, well, why should I believe the BBC more than anywhere else? Why, you know, what do you say to people? Why should the BBC be regarded as the gold standard, or is it just another news outlet? Why should people trust what you produce?
Well, it's a good question to ask, because I think the BBC can't simply rest on assumptions about what the audience think about us. You know, we believe we are the most trusted international broadcaster, but we have to earn that trust every day, and it's very precious, and we can't lose it. So, but I suppose my answer is that the BBC is sort of almost unique, even among public service broadcasters, that I would say internationally that it's owned by every person in the UK. So the universal licence fee means that every UK household has a stake in the BBC, you know, voluntarily or otherwise, but that is the way it is. And that's a unique model. It has, you know, we have some UK government money, we have a lot of licence fee money, we also have a very vibrant commercial business that supports BBC World News and BBC.com. And I think for those reasons, and because of the BBC's Royal Charter that's enshrined in law, it's an 11-year term that means it's, you know, very, very resistant to political interference because it doesn't have its funding and charter settled every year, but it lasts for 11 years outside of an electoral cycle. We have an open and accountable complaints procedure. We often admit when we get things wrong. I seem to spend a lot of my time doing that sometimes, but that's good. I think, you know, that what differentiates us from Russia today are some of the things I've mentioned, that we are clearly not beholden to a particular political or even national set of policy interests. We belong to everyone in Britain, and I think that's a really powerful way of putting it. It's the way I normally talk about it, because you know, the idea of impartiality is a bit nebulous, and actually I don't think translates that well. It's a very hot button issue in the UK, but I always talk about the BBC's independence over its impartiality, because I think actually independence is what audiences are really thirsting for. They're thirsting for a trustworthy source of news, whether it's us or others, who they genuinely know is independent and not beholden to a particular state, commercial, or other set of interests.
Well, I'd like to thank Jamie Angus for coming back here twice, and here's a token of appreciation from the Foreign Correspondents Club.
Thank you, Keith. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you. Lovely to sit. Thanks a lot. Really appreciate it.